I can't forget the moment I discovered that the water in my storage tanks had been tampered with. Water is life, especially on the sprawling edge of the suburban neighborhood where I live, where some of us still rely on our own wells or water storage for everyday use. One morning, I turned on my tap and caught an acrid stench, like chemicals mixed with rotting trash. My stomach lurched as I realized something was horribly wrong. At first, I hoped it was just a maintenance glitch, maybe some algae buildup. But deep down, a gnawing unease told me I was about to uncover something far worse. My home sits at the far edge of the community, with a big backyard where I keep a couple of large water tanks for emergencies and gardening. When I looked inside those tanks, I nearly gagged. The water was thick, cloudy, and had this oily sheen across the surface. It wasn't just gross, it looked downright toxic. Panic surged through me as I imagined my family, or even neighborhood kids, accidentally consuming that water. Heart pounding, I ran to call the local water testing lab. As I waited for test results, I tried to think logically. Who would do something like this? My mind lingered on the Homeowners Association. It might sound paranoid, but I've been butting heads with the HOA ever since I installed solar panels and a small greenhouse on my property, an arrangement that apparently went against their aesthetic guidelines. They had threatened me with fines, but I never dreamed they'd stoop to anything this extreme. Yet, every sign pointed to sabotage. When the lab results came back, I felt my stomach turn. Elevated levels of harsh industrial chemicals, contaminants that had no place near a residential water system. The lab technician was blunt. This was deliberate. You need to alert the authorities. And that's when I knew my conflict with the HOA had crossed a line no one should ever have to confront. With a trembling hand, I dialed the number for our local police department, silently hoping I was wrong about the HOA being involved. If they really had poisoned my water, what else were they capable of? My mind raced as I waited on hold, already planning out how I'd protect my family, how I'd prove what had been done, and, if I was correct in my suspicions, how I'd make every last one of them regret crossing that line. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound in the house, every creak in the pipes, set me on edge, as if someone might be creeping around outside. My spouse tried to reassure me, but the image of that tainted water kept replaying in my head. Who would do something so cruel and reckless? Could my neighbors really be that hostile, enough to risk poisoning a family? The next morning, the police arrived to collect samples from the tanks. I showed them the lab report, the watery sludge, and even the footprints I'd found in the muddy patch behind my greenhouse. They were careful, empathetic even, but I could sense their skepticism. "We'll do our best, sir," one officer said, scribbling notes. But without eyewitnesses or security footage, it might be tough to find a culprit. Security footage. The words rattled around in my head long after they left. I had installed a few trail cameras around my property, mostly to deter coyotes from getting into my vegetable patch. I raced to check the footage, feeling a mixture of anxiety and hope. Was it possible I'd caught the saboteur on camera? As I sifted through the pixelated nighttime videos, something stood out. Just after midnight on the previous Saturday, a dark figure crept into view, carrying what looked like a plastic container. The figure wore a hoodie, the face concealed, but they moved with an unsettling confidence, like they knew exactly where to go. My heart pounded as I watched them approach the water tanks. A short minute later, they slipped away into the shadows. The angle was too poor to see a license plate or any identifying details, but I had proof that this was no accident. I immediately called the detective assigned to my case, emailing him the footage. He sounded mildly impressed, less skepticism in his voice this time, but still non-committal about whether it was enough to finger a suspect. "We'll do what we can," he said, promising to review it thoroughly. But as I ended the call, I recalled the mounting tension with the HOA. Ever since I installed those solar panels, their president, Mr. Fletcher, had been sending me ominous letters. He harped on about community standards and authorized aesthetic choices. A month prior, he'd fined me for having excessive water storage structures visible from the street. Never mind that they weren't visible to anyone but me and a few curious squirrels. Beneath the anger and suspicion, a chill of vulnerability coursed through me. If Fletcher or someone on the HOA had truly gone this far, what would they do next? Knowing them, they'd be all too happy to paint me as the troublemaker if I tried to confront them publicly. I sensed I needed something bigger, a plan not just to expose them, but to make sure they never tried this again. And if there's one thing I'm good at, it's creative payback. I spent the rest of the day pacing around my property, going over every possibility in my mind. Was it really the HOA, or was someone else out to get me? I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Yet, every piece of circumstantial evidence pulled me back to the same people who'd harassed me over petty infractions for months. What would motivate them to risk committing a serious crime? Were they trying to force me to remove my greenhouse or scare me into leaving the neighborhood altogether? Questions swirled, but I resolved then and there, if it turned out to be the HOA, I'd hit them back so hard they'd never forget it. Something brazen, symbolic, and absolutely impossible for them to sweep under the rug. And as I stared at the rancid water, an idea began to form, something that involved a whole lot of aromatic justice. Despite my mounting suspicions, I didn't want to accuse the HOA outright without more solid proof. The footage I had might raise eyebrows, but it wouldn't be enough to convince the authorities to go after Mr. Fletcher, especially if they needed a motive that pointed directly to him. So I took a different approach. I started talking to my neighbors, discreetly prying for any hints that the HOA had grown more hostile than usual. Most folks expressed shock about the poisoning. A few offered condolences, but seemed reluctant to get involved. Who could blame them? Crossing the HOA was like stepping on a landmine. You never knew if you'd set off a barrage of petty fines or even a lien on your property. Yet, in hushed tones, a handful of neighbors mentioned odd run-ins with certain board members. One woman whispered she'd been blackmailed into paying extra fees to keep her backyard shed. Another man admitted he overheard Fletcher boasting about removing troublemakers from the neighborhood. The more I heard, the more certain I became. If anyone was audacious enough to sabotage my water supply, it was that power-hungry clique on the board. But I needed something to tie Fletcher directly to the crime, an invoice, a text message, or even a witness. Then, in a surprising twist, an unlikely ally stepped forward, Miguel, a landscaper who sometimes did odd jobs around the neighborhood. I'd hired him a few times to trim hedges near my greenhouse. Out of the blue, he showed up at my door one evening, looking jittery and glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to leap out at any moment. "Poor favor," he murmured, voice low. "We need to talk somewhere private." We ended up in my backyard, far from street view. Miguel fidgeted with his cap, clearly nervous. "I heard what happened to your water tanks. I think Fletcher had something to do with it." My heart pounded. "Why do you say that?" Miguel swallowed hard, casting a wary glance at my house. "Last week, he asked me if I had access to any industrial-strength weed killers or pesticides. Said it was for a pest problem in the community garden. I told him no, but he kept pushing, offering extra money. It felt off. My mind reeled at the implication. Industrial chemicals? Could Fletcher have used them on my water supply? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Miguel inhaled shakily. "Because I saw your security footage on the local news coverage you posted online, and I recognized the build of that person. I'm almost sure it's one of Fletcher's friends. He has a couple of guys he uses for under-the-table jobs. They're always wearing hoodies and sneaking around in the evenings when most folks are asleep." Everything clicked into place like some horrifying jigsaw puzzle. Fletcher, with his petty vendettas and willingness to flout HOA rules for personal gain, must have escalated into sabotage. And now I had someone who could place him near the chemicals that likely ended up in my tanks. It wasn't a smoking gun yet, but it was more than I'd had before. Suddenly, Miguel's eyes darted behind me. "We have to hurry," he whispered. "I'm supposed to meet Fletcher tomorrow for a landscaping gig near the HOA office. Maybe I can keep an eye out for something, some kind of evidence." I paused, uncertain if I wanted to involve him any further. If Fletcher discovered Miguel was snooping, he could ruin the poor guy's livelihood. Then again, this might be my only chance to catch Fletcher red-handed. "All right," I said softly, "but be careful. Let me know if you see or hear anything suspicious." We parted ways under the pale glow of my back porch light, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Miguel was sticking his neck out for me at great personal risk. That night, my mind raced. If Fletcher had indeed orchestrated the poisoning, it wouldn't be hard for him to deny it or blame it on a rogue contractor. I needed a plan that would expose him and force him to face real consequences. And that's when my imagination latched onto the perfect form of messy, unavoidable payback, one involving something foul-smelling, impossible to ignore, and guaranteed to make headlines: manure. Over the years, I'd built a small network of local farmers while maintaining my greenhouse. If I wanted large quantities of manure, I knew exactly where to get it, enough to create one colossal, stomach-churning spectacle. But as that vengeful idea took shape in my mind, a nagging voice reminded me, this would be a serious escalation. If the HOA had attacked me covertly, was I prepared to retaliate so openly? I recalled the rancid stench in my tanks, the risk to my family's health, and the fear that had gripped me in my own home. In the face of that memory, my reservations began to dissolve. They'd crossed the line first. Maybe I couldn't bring Fletcher down through polite channels alone. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, or, in this case, chemicals with compost. Little did I know, a twist of fate would soon threaten to unravel my carefully laid revenge plot. Because while I was busy planning my grand manure payback, someone else was moving behind the scenes. Someone with a vendetta of their own, one that might turn the entire neighborhood against me if I wasn't careful. I spent the next few days anxiously waiting for Miguel's update, my nerves on edge with every ring of my phone. Each night, I'd double-check my trail cameras and peek outside my window, half expecting to spot one of Fletcher's hooded cronies lurking by the fence. The sense of vulnerability felt worse than ever. I was convinced Fletcher had done something monstrous, yet I had no definitive proof tying him to the sabotage. What little sleep I managed to get was restless. I kept replaying different revenge scenarios in my mind, none quite as dramatic or cathartic as my manure idea. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be flirting with disaster. Dumping hundreds of pounds of manure in the HOA office? If someone caught me in the act, it could mean criminal charges. But every time I pictured Fletcher's smug face, reminding me of how easily he believed he could break me, my resolve hardened. He'd tried to poison my family. There was no going back. On the third morning, Miguel texted me, "I have something. Meet at the park, near the gazebo." My heart thumped as I grabbed my car keys and headed out, deliberately avoiding the main roads in case Fletcher had someone watching. The community park was empty that early, except for a stray jogger or two. Miguel stood by a graffiti-scarred picnic table, chewing his lip nervously. Without preamble, he thrust a small plastic vial into my hand, labeled with a chemical name I couldn't immediately identify. "I found that in Fletcher's supply shed behind the HOA office," he whispered, glancing around like we were exchanging state secrets. He left the door unlocked while he was inside talking with someone. "I don't know if this is exactly what he used on your tanks, but it looks nasty. Says it can contaminate large water sources if used in high concentrations." I felt a jolt of fear and triumph. Fear, because the implications of that chemical were terrifying. Triumph, because this was the piece of the puzzle I needed, physical proof that Fletcher had something capable of causing the kind of contamination I'd seen in my tanks. "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice low. "You have no idea how big this is." He nodded, anxiety etched on his face. "Just be careful. If Fletcher catches on that we took this, he'll know someone's helping you from the inside." I tucked the vial into my jacket. "No one will know it came from you," I promised. "Let me handle the fallout." But as I hurried back to my car, my mind churned with a new suspicion. If Fletcher was brazen enough to keep that stuff at the HOA office, was he planning to use it on anyone else who defied him? Or had I only uncovered one piece of a much bigger operation? That afternoon, while I was working in my greenhouse, carefully avoiding the water tanks until I could replace them, a loud rap on the door jolted me. I opened it to find Mrs. Robbins, one of my more outspoken neighbors. Her usually friendly face looked pinched with worry. "I don't know what you've been up to," she said, crossing her arms. "But the HOA just posted notices on a bunch of houses, claiming a community-wide hazard that might involve your property." My heart sank. What kind of hazard? She handed me a bright orange flyer, printed with alarmist warnings about contaminated water. According to the notice, an unidentified resident had stored hazardous substances that threatened the entire neighborhood's groundwater. The flyer blamed improper chemical disposal and even hinted that law enforcement might need to intervene. I felt my pulse spike. This was Fletcher's countermove, flipping the script to label me as the dangerous one who'd compromised the neighborhood's water. He was trying to isolate me, paint me as the culprit, and rally everyone against me. "This is insane," I muttered, gripping the paper. "He's accusing me of what he actually did." Mrs. Robbins exhaled, glancing around the greenhouse. "I don't believe this story for a second. But some neighbors are already stirred up, wondering if your greenhouse experiments have gone wrong. You need to clear this up before people start panicking." A swirl of anger and apprehension knotted in my stomach. Fletcher was planting seeds of doubt, using fear to mobilize the very people who'd otherwise be on my side. If I didn't act fast, I might find myself facing not just dirty looks but a mob convinced I was the neighborhood's greatest menace. Escalating conflict. That evening, I set out to restore my reputation. I invited a few neighbors over, people I trusted not to buy into Fletcher's propaganda, and showed them the lab report confirming what was in my tanks, and the suspicious chemical vial Miguel had smuggled out. Their faces registered alarm, then outrage as I explained the timeline of events, the footage of the hooded figure, and my existing feud with the HOA. But just as we were piecing together a plan to confront Fletcher publicly, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Don't even think about showing that vial around. Accidents happen, especially to people who stick their nose where it doesn't belong." My hands shook. Whoever sent this knew about the evidence Miguel gave me, and they were threatening me if I tried to use it. It felt like a direct challenge, either back off or risk an accident. I showed the message to my neighbors, and their faces paled. "This is serious," one of them murmured, voice trembling. "What if they come after you again? Or anyone who helps you?" I inhaled sharply, letting the anger course through me until it overshadowed the fear. If Fletcher and his ilk were this desperate to silence me, it meant I was closer to exposing them than ever. That gave me a grim kind of determination. "I'm not backing down," I said through gritted teeth. They picked the wrong person to threaten. By midnight, I had made up my mind, no more half measures. If Fletcher wanted to paint me as the neighborhood menace, fine. I'd show everyone what a real menace looked like, by delivering the biggest, smelliest wake-up call of his life. Using my farmer contacts, I ordered a massive load of manure to be delivered on short notice, hundreds of pounds, more than enough to make a truly unforgettable statement. Yes, it was extreme, and yes, I risked legal blowback. But so what? I was done playing by the rules with someone who'd tried to poison my family. Despite my adrenaline-fueled confidence, a deeper dread lurked in my gut. There was no telling how far Fletcher or his cronies would go to protect themselves. I found myself checking every lock in my house 3 times before bed, half expecting to wake up and find my greenhouse burned to the ground or my car tires slashed. Yet the alternative, to roll over and let him frame me, wasn't an option. At this point, our neighborhood was perched on a knife's edge, with rumors swirling and loyalties being tested. Even the people who believed me didn't want to risk becoming targets. And that isolation made me even more determined to stage a dramatic, public showdown that no one could ignore. I had no idea what the fallout would look like, and frankly, I didn't care anymore. Fletcher had taken things too far, and I planned to send a message he'd never forget, one that would cling to his precious HOA office walls and nostrils for days to come. The next morning, I woke up to find a new HOA notice taped brazenly over my front door. The neon orange slip practically screamed at me. Warning: immediate compliance required. Residents with unauthorized chemical storage will face emergency fines and possible eviction. I tore the paper down, disgust curling in my gut. Fletcher was doubling down on painting me as the neighborhood villain. Worse yet, a few frightened neighbors had started to believe it. They saw the words chemical storage and conjured up images of me stockpiling toxic sludge in my greenhouse. Rumors swirled that I'd sabotaged my own tanks just to discredit the HOA, an absurd notion, but fear and gossip move fast in a community already on edge. Still, my retaliatory plan was in motion. The manure delivery was scheduled for 2 days later, time enough to finalize the perfect location and figure out a quick escape route. Every minute felt like a balancing act on a razor's edge. If Fletcher grew suspicious of my intentions, he'd likely strike first. Or, if the authorities sided with him, they might confiscate my new ammunition before I could use it. Just when I thought I had everything under control, an unsettling development shook me. Miguel stopped answering my texts. At first, I chalked it up to him being busy with a job. But by late afternoon, I tried calling, and his phone went straight to voicemail. A knot formed in my stomach. Had Fletcher discovered Miguel was feeding me information? Growing uneasy, I drove by Miguel's usual landscaping spots, searching for his truck. Nothing. Finally, I approached a neighbor who often hired him. She lowered her voice conspiratorially, eyes darting around. He canceled our appointment, said he was leaving town for a bit. Some emergency. Her pause and the worry in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced it was just a family matter. My anxiety flared. If Miguel had been intimidated into fleeing, it meant Fletcher's circle was more dangerous than I'd imagined. The text threats aimed at me were bad enough, but physically running someone out of town? That took the conflict to a whole new level. Anger simmered beneath my fear. This was Fletcher's modus operandi: quiet intimidation, manipulation, and scapegoating. Dumping Manure in his office started feeling less like an act of revenge and more like a moral obligation to expose a monster. That evening, I decided to go on offense. Armed with the chemical vial Miguel had procured, I knocked on the doors of a few respected community members, the kind of neighbors who hadn't entirely bought into Fletcher's spin. I showed them the label, explained how it matched the contamination in my water tanks. Though some looked uneasy at the idea of me storing such evidence in my home, a handful recognized it as a major red flag. "This is bigger than some petty HOA rule," one woman murmured, her face grim. "If Fletcher's behind this, our entire neighborhood is at risk." Word spread, and soon, a pocket of residents began whispering about calling an emergency meeting, one that Fletcher couldn't control. The notion gained momentum. If enough people demanded it, the board would have to let us speak. But I knew Fletcher would fight tooth and nail to avoid a public showdown on my terms. Late that night, as I was reviewing the manure logistics, how best to unload it, how to minimize my time inside that rancid environment, a neighbor hammered on my door in a panic. Through the peephole, I saw it was Mrs. Robbins again, breathless and wild-eyed. I yanked the door open. "They're at your greenhouse," she blurted, clutching her phone. A group of them, maybe 5 or 6 men. I saw them sneaking around with flashlights. My blood ran cold. Had Fletcher sent a cleanup squad to plant fake evidence? Or to destroy my greenhouse? Either way, I grabbed a flashlight and, ignoring Mrs. Robbins's pleas to call the police first, sprinted around the side of my house. Adrenaline thudded in my ears as I approached the greenhouse door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, a single flashlight beam danced across the plants. I glimpsed multiple figures, rummaging through shelves. My heart pounded against my ribcage, and for a moment I considered backing off and calling the cops. But the rustle of plastic told me they were planting something. Maybe more chemicals or bogus containers to incriminate me further. Summoning my courage, I burst through the door and aimed my own flashlight directly at them. "Get out of here!" I roared, voice shaking with anger. They froze, momentarily blinded by the light. I registered at least 3 hooded shapes, one bigger than the others. One cursed under his breath, and in the confusion, I lunged, grabbing the nearest figure's sleeve. He twisted away, sending a shelf of seedling trays crashing to the ground. Panicked, the intruders pushed past me, bolting through the greenhouse door like startled deer. I staggered, nearly toppling over spilled potting soil. By the time I made it outside, they had vanished into the shadows, leaving footprints in the soft earth. I stood there panting, my mind racing. They'd come this close to framing me, or worse. My greenhouse was in shambles, but a quick scan assured me they hadn't torched the place. Not yet, anyway. Shaken to the core, I called the police, who showed up an hour later with their usual sympathetic but non-committal stance. No ID, no license plates, no crime scene evidence beyond footprints. Yet, as I looked at the trail of destruction they'd left behind, my resolve solidified further. If Fletcher and his cronies were willing to break in and terrorize me, there was no telling how far they'd go to paint me as the problem. I had to hit back. Hard, fast, and publicly. With dawn still hours away, I picked up my phone and reconfirmed the manure delivery. "No matter what," I told the supplier, "I need that load at 6 a.m., right at the HOA office." The driver sounded perplexed but agreed, as long as the payment was in cash up front. Fine by me. I crawled into bed near 3 in the morning, exhaustion throbbing behind my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my lids, I envisioned men in hoodies poisoning my water, tearing apart my greenhouse, driving Miguel out of town. Images of Fletcher's smug smile flashed like a neon sign, daring me to do something drastic. And I intended to oblige. The next day, I kept a low profile, making final tweaks to my plan. My biggest fear was a direct confrontation at the HOA office. Someone official might intervene before I dumped the manure. But that was a risk I had to take. If the community saw Fletcher's seat of power buried under 470 pounds of foul-smelling fertilizer, maybe they'd finally realize who the real danger was in this neighborhood. Of course, there was one twist I hadn't seen coming. Just as I thought I had the perfect approach, an unmarked envelope appeared on my porch. Inside was a single photo, me, talking to Miguel in the park, the plastic vial clearly visible in my hand. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink. "We're watching." My blood turned to ice. Whoever took that photo had been tailing me for days. They might know about my plan, maybe even the manure. Yet, in a perverse way, the threat felt like gasoline on a dying fire. Instead of backing down, it stoked my anger. Fletcher and his cronies might know I was coming, but I'd show them anyway. Because you can't poison a person's life and expect them to lie down forever. That night, I barely slept again, the photo and the looming confrontation dancing in my thoughts. Despite the risk, I felt a strange calm. I had nothing left to lose. Fletcher's sabotage, threats, and infiltration of my greenhouse had pushed me too far. If tomorrow was the day I faced the wrath of his entire HOA machine, so be it. I'd make sure they remembered it, and smelled it, for a very long time. When the day finally arrived, I was on pins and needles before dawn even broke. A dull ache pounded behind my eyes from lack of sleep, but my adrenaline surged each time I remembered that cryptic photograph someone had slipped under my door. Despite knowing I was being watched, I refused to abandon the plan. Fletcher had gone too far, and if he thought a little scare tactic would deter me, he was dead wrong. At 5 in the morning, I took one last walk around my property, double-checking every lock, every camera angle. The greenhouse still bore the marks of the intruder's sabotage, overturned pots, torn plastic. It stirred my fury all over again, reminding me why I had no choice but to go through with the manure dump. Just thinking about it made my stomach lurch, a ton of foul-smelling sludge delivered right to the HOA's shiny office doors. Poetic justice, indeed. My phone buzzed, slicing through the silence. The manure hauler was on schedule, waiting at a nearby truck stop. "Meet me at the corner of Maple and Cedar in 30, the driver said in a raspy tone. "Cash first, then I follow you. We gotta do this quick." I could hear uncertainty in his voice, like he was worried about crossing an invisible line. I couldn't blame him. He might have been used to hauling farm waste, but not orchestrating a literal stink bomb in the center of a suburban development. I dressed in dark clothes, nothing too conspicuous, just enough to avoid being recognized at a distance. Before leaving, I tucked the chemical vial and the incriminating lab report into a hidden pocket in my jacket. My original plan was just to deliver my message, but a part of me wondered if I could also confront Fletcher with the evidence in public. Maybe even film his reaction. One thing was certain, if the community saw me produce the proof, it would turn Fletcher's entire smear campaign against him. The roads were eerily quiet in the morning haze, only the occasional pair of headlights passing on the opposite side. Maple and Cedar was a deserted intersection on the edge of town, flanked by a row of half-finished condos. I spotted the manure truck's bulky silhouette parked under a broken street lamp. The driver, a burly man with a knitted cap, hopped out when he saw my car approach. He jerked his chin at me in greeting. "You really want this load at the HOA building?" His tone said he thought I was crazy. "You know, they're gonna call the cops the second I pull up." "I'll handle it," I promised, handing over the thick envelope of cash. My heart was pounding, but a strange sense of calm had settled over me. I couldn't turn back now. He counted the bills under the flickering streetlight, nodding in satisfaction. "All right, your funeral. I'll follow you in. Just tell me where to tip it. Once it's dumped, we're done. You deal with the fallout, not me." "Agreed," I said. In that moment, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. I was crossing a line I could never uncross. But Fletcher had already taught me that lines meant nothing to him. We started off down the side streets, the rumble of the manure truck echoing against empty sidewalks. My plan was to lead him to the narrow driveway behind the HOA office, Fletcher's private parking spot. My contact at City Planning had once shown me the building layout, so I knew there was a back entrance used mainly by staff. With any luck, we'd block that door completely before anyone could react. Halfway there, the driver honked 3 times, urgent blasts that made my heart jolt. I glanced in my rearview mirror to see him pulling over to the curb, hazard lights flashing. Confused, I slowed down and parked, stepping out to see what was wrong. He climbed down from the cab, pointing up ahead. "Cop car," he grunted. I saw it make a turn at the next intersection. They might be setting up a checkpoint. A wave of tension rolled through me. If word had spread about my manure operation, Fletcher could have tipped off the police. The last thing I wanted was to be hauled in on suspicion of illegal dumping before I even reached the HOA building. As we stood there under the dim glow of a streetlight, another car rumbled by, slowing to a near crawl. My gut twisted. Was it just a random passerby, or someone tailing us? The driver's expression mirrored my unease. Time was slipping away, and if we lingered, we risked a run-in with either the cops or one of Fletcher's henchmen. Neither option appealed. "All right, new plan," I muttered, checking a map on my phone. "We'll take the alley behind the strip mall. It'll come out 2 blocks from the HOA office. We can avoid the main intersections that way." He shrugged, clearly skeptical but willing to follow my lead since he already had the cash. "Let's just hope your friend in there hasn't locked the gates or something." Anxiety burned in my chest as I hopped back into my car. I signaled for him to follow, praying we wouldn't encounter another police cruiser. If we got pulled over, how would I even begin to explain a massive load of manure traveling into a pristine suburban zone at daybreak? Inside my mind, 1,000 scenarios played out. Cops forcing us to turn back, Fletcher's goons confronting us in the alley, or a random bystander calling 911 the second they saw something suspicious. But beyond all the noise, a singular, resolute thought carried me forward. If I didn't do this, Fletcher would keep running my name through the mud, and nobody would ever believe the truth about what he'd done. Stepping on the gas, I led the lumbering truck down the narrow streets, the sun just beginning to lighten the horizon. In a few minutes, the HOA office would come into view, and with it, my chance to exact a very public, very messy revenge that Fletcher would never be able to bury. The alley behind the strip mall was cramped, dumpsters lined both sides, and stray cats skittered away from our headlights. The early morning sky glowed a pale gold, illuminating graffiti-splashed walls and scattered debris. My heart hammered as I guided my car through, glancing back every few seconds to make sure the manure truck could squeeze through the tight turns. The driver stayed on my bumper, hazard lights off to avoid drawing attention. When we finally emerged from the alley, the HOA office loomed 2 blocks away, a squat, single-story building with a faux brick facade and meticulously trimmed hedges. A small parking lot sat behind it, usually deserted this early, but I spotted a dark SUV parked in one corner. My pulse spiked. Could it be Fletcher's? Or maybe one of his hired heavies standing guard? I pulled over behind a row of tall shrubs, motioning for the manure truck to do the same. We killed our engines, letting the early morning hush settle around us. The driver hopped down and trudged over to my window. "This is it, right?" he asked, keeping his voice low. I nodded, my gaze locked on that dark SUV. "Yeah, that's the building. We need to dump the load right at the rear entrance, where they can't just shovel it away easily." The driver scratched his stubbly chin. "All right, but if we get caught in the act, you're the one who's got to stall whoever shows up, not me." "Understood," I said. My stomach churned at the thought. I'd come too far to turn back now. An alarming interruption. Just as I was about to start the car, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off. Last warning." I clenched my teeth. They were watching me, or at least they had some tip-off that I was up to something big. Could Fletcher see us lurking behind these shrubs, or was he bluffing? Either way, I refused to be intimidated again. Gritting my teeth, I turned the key and led the truck into the small parking lot, hoping that if anyone was inside the SUV, they wouldn't react until it was too late. The truck rumbled behind me, rattling with the weight of the manure load. Every second felt drawn out, every sound magnified, the hiss of the truck's brakes, the hum of a distant street lamp, even my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. I forced myself to stay calm, pulling up to the rear entrance. When I shut off my car, the driver swung his door open, hopped back into the truck's cab, and prepared to raise the dump bed. "Let's do it," I mouthed, stepping out into the cool morning air. My nostrils flared at the pungent odor wafting from the truck's rear gate. One swift motion, and hundreds of pounds of manure would cascade straight onto the HOA's pristine doorway. But just as the driver reached for the release lever, a sudden commotion erupted. The back door to the HOA office flung open, revealing two silhouettes. One was definitely Fletcher. His silhouette was unmistakable, tall and broad-shouldered, favoring polo shirts even in the chilly hours before sunrise. The other figure wore a hoodie, face obscured. They froze in the doorway, apparently startled to see a massive truck poised at the loading bay. For a split second, nobody moved. Then Fletcher's voice barked out, echoing off the walls, "Hey! What the hell do you think you're doing?" My adrenaline surged. I could practically feel the driver's hesitation. He might have been rethinking this entire job. But we'd come too far. We couldn't just give up and drive away. Summoning every ounce of nerve I had, I strode forward. "Nice morning, Fletcher," I called, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're up early. Planning any more poison drop-offs?" He stiffened, eyes darting to the truck. Even in the dim light, I saw realization dawn in his expression. He must have guessed what we were about to do, and I could see the mixture of horror and fury flicker across his face. "You're trespassing," he growled, stepping out onto the concrete. "I can have you arrested for this." Behind him, the hooded figure took a step back, keeping distance as if to avoid the spotlight. My mind flashed to Miguel's warnings about Fletcher's shady underlings. This could be one of them, ready to strike if things got physical. I held my ground. That's rich, coming from the guy who broke into my greenhouse and tried to frame me. Not to mention the poison in my water. He threw his arms out in feigned innocence. "Prove it," he sneered. "Your little conspiracy theories won't hold up in court." Without missing a beat, I fished out the small plastic vial Miguel had given me. "I've got proof right here," I said, stepping closer so Fletcher could see the label. "And a lab report that matches the contaminants in my water tanks. Care to explain why you had a stash of this exact chemical in your HOA supply shed?" For the briefest moment, Fletcher's bravado wavered. His eyes flicked to the vial, then to the hooded figure. It was as if he expected backup, but the figure just stood there, silent and rigid. Suddenly, a mechanical grinding noise shattered the tension. The driver had decided to act, pulling the lever to release the massive gate at the truck's rear. In a split second, a cascade of manure thundered to the ground, forming a stinking, steaming heap that rapidly spread across the pavement, directly blocking the back door of the HOA office. The smell hit us in an overpowering wave, and I almost gagged. Fletcher's outrage was immediate. "Are you insane?" he roared, stepping back as the foul pile threatened to ooze across his expensive shoes. The hooded figure recoiled, one hand over their nose. I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of triumph. The expression on Fletcher's face was priceless, part horror, part disbelief. "Now the entire neighborhood will know what kind of filth you tried to pull," I spat, my voice raised above the sound of shifting manure. "Maybe they'll even smell it from their porches." The driver hopped down from his cab, wiping sweat from his brow. "I did my job. I'm out," he muttered, hustling past me, presumably heading for his truck to make a quick getaway. My own escape plan suddenly loomed large in my mind. I needed to vanish before any cops showed up. But just as I was about to back away, the hooded figure stepped forward with unexpected speed. In one fluid motion, they lunged toward me, slamming me against the side of the building. My head collided with the brick facade, and stars danced in my vision. I caught a glimpse of Fletcher's triumphant smirk over the figure's shoulder. "You want to play dirty?" he snarled, stepping closer. "You have no idea who you're messing with. One phone call, and this entire stunt will land squarely on you. Trespassing, vandalism, illegal dumping, I'll bury you in court." Despite the pain throbbing in my temple, a grim sense of satisfaction flared in my chest. "Not if I bury you first," I managed to hiss, lifting the vial so it glinted in the early morning light. "This ties you to a criminal act, Fletcher, and I'm not the only one who has a copy of the report." He hesitated, the threat clearly hitting its mark. I knew if he attacked me outright, I could scream for help, alert the few neighbors who might be awake, or even call the police myself, then show them the evidence. The hooded figure tightened their grip on my jacket, but Fletcher raised a hand, signaling for them to let go. Steam still rose from the fresh mound of manure, and the stench filled every breath. The hooded figure sidestepped gingerly around it, possibly contemplating whether to flee. Fletcher's glare bored into me, but I glared right back. We were at a stalemate. He had intimidation and local clout on his side, while I held the proof that could shatter his veneer of legitimacy. Just then, headlights cut across the parking lot. My heart dropped as I realized it could be the police, responding to some early morning complaint. The driver had fled, leaving behind his stinking handiwork, and I was left facing Fletcher, half-dazed but still defiant. A single question thundered in my mind. Had I accomplished enough to expose his crimes, or was this just the beginning of an even bigger fight? Those headlights in the early light pinned us in place like animals caught in a trap. I half expected to see the police rolling up to haul me off for illegal dumping. Fletcher stood there, breathing hard, manure fumes swirling around him like a dark aura. My shoulders burned where the hooded figure had rammed me into the wall, but I forced myself to stay upright. If I was going down, I'd make sure Fletcher's reputation went down with me. The vehicle slowed to a crawl, and to my surprise, it wasn't a squad car. It was an older pickup truck, headlights flickering in the growing dawn. Out climbed none other than Mrs. Robbins, my neighbor who'd warned me about intruders. She took one look at the steaming mound of manure and practically did a double-take. Then, noticing Fletcher's furious stance and my disheveled appearance, she squared her shoulders like she was stepping into battle. "What's going on here?" she demanded, stepping closer with her chin held high. I saw her nose crinkle from the stench, but she didn't back away. Fletcher spun around, his rage switching targets. "This lunatic," he snarled, pointing at me, "dumped a truckload of waste on private property. Call the cops, he's out of control." The hooded figure still hovered nearby, half concealed by shadows, as if waiting for a signal to pounce again. But Mrs. Robbins didn't so much as blink in Fletcher's direction. Instead, she turned her gaze to me. "Are you all right? You're bleeding." I touched my temple and winced, feeling a sticky warmth there, blood from my collision with the brick wall. "Yeah," I said, forcing a wry grin. "I'm fine, thanks to your heads up the other night. Wish I could say the same for the HOA building." Her eyes darted to the pile of manure, then flicked back to Fletcher. She pulled her phone from her pocket, and for a split second, I thought she was about to dial 911. Instead, she aimed the camera right at us. "Fletcher, care to explain why there's a chemical container in your hand?" she said pointedly, zooming in on the plastic vial he'd snatched from me. I felt a surge of vindication. He must have grabbed it during our scuffle. Now he stood there in plain sight, holding the piece of evidence that could damn him. The glare on his face morphed from anger to something closer to panic. He dropped the vial, kicking it away into the grass like he'd touched a hot coal. "What are you talking about?" "I'm holding nothing," he snapped, face red. Mrs. Robbins snorted. "I've been hearing rumors, Fletcher, rumors that you and your pals have been harassing residents." She turned her phone to capture the fresh mountain of manure. "I don't love the smell, but it sure is symbolic. Our entire neighborhood is fed up with your bull." Suddenly, voices came from the far side of the parking lot. More neighbors, attracted by the commotion, and possibly the overpowering odor, trickled in. People in pajamas and hoodies, some on their phones, some pressing cloths to their noses. They gawked at the spectacle, me looking roughed up, Fletcher seething in front of a massive reeking heap, and Mrs. Robbins filming everything. A few recognized the hooded figure as one of Fletcher's known associates, which set off hushed whispers of alarm. Fletcher's eyes darted frantically around, searching for a way out. The faintest trace of desperation crept into his voice. "You're all being misled," he bellowed. "This man has broken countless HOA rules. Look at the vandalism he's caused." One by one, the neighbors turned their phones on him. I heard a few people muttering, "Didn't he file that weird complaint against the greenhouse? Isn't he the one who tried to run off that landscaper? I heard he's been fining people non-stop for petty stuff." By now, the stench from the manure was enough to make eyes water. More importantly, it forced everyone to keep their distance from the back door, Fletcher included. The expression on his face said it all. He knew the tide was turning. Then came the inevitable. An actual police cruiser pulled into the lot. The officer climbed out, looking baffled by the spectacle. Covering his nose, he approached with caution. "All right, I need to know what's going on," he said in that firm, no-nonsense tone. "Who's responsible for this?" Fletcher practically lunged at the chance to accuse me. "He did," he yelled, pointing an accusatory finger. "He just dumped all that, on camera, I might add. I want him arrested for destruction of property, trespassing, and anything else you can charge him with." My heart hammered. I braced for the worst. But Mrs. Robbins stepped in, phone raised. "Officer, Fletcher's been threatening this neighbor and others for months. There's evidence of him tampering with water supplies and forging complaints." She panned her phone to capture the crowd. "Plenty of witnesses here who can attest to it." I forced myself to speak up, voice shaking from anger and adrenaline. "Officer, I admit I dumped the manure. I was driven to it by Fletcher's harassment, and worse." I gestured to the ground, hoping to find the chemical vial Fletcher had kicked away. My gaze swept the parking lot, and sure enough, it lay near a storm drain, the label glinting. "That's the poison he used to contaminate my water tanks. I have a lab report proving it matches the substances that nearly made my family sick." The officer frowned, clearly taken aback by the gravity of the accusation. He walked over, careful not to step in the manure, and bent to examine the vial. "Is this true?" he asked Fletcher, tone shifting toward suspicion. Fletcher blustered, his arrogance crumbling. I've never seen that before. He's framing me. This is all just some insane stunt to turn the neighborhood against me." But from the crowd of onlookers, voices rose to challenge him. One neighbor called out, "Then why'd you have it in your hand?" Another chimed in, "We all saw you drop it, Fletcher." The tension coiled in the air, thick as the stench. The officer glanced around, sensing the widespread hostility toward the HOA president. He took out a notebook, asking each person if they'd provide a statement. I locked eyes with Fletcher. Gone was the smug grin. He looked cornered, furious but outmaneuvered. His hooded associate stood off to the side, presumably trying to figure out an exit strategy. Meanwhile, the policeman radioed for backup, probably realizing he was in over his head with this chaotic scene. Somehow, amid the swirling odor and heated accusations, a wave of relief washed over me. This wasn't just me versus Fletcher anymore. It was an entire community coming to terms with his bullying tactics. I might still face legal trouble for the manure fiasco, but at least now everything was out in the open. His intimidation, the chemical sabotage, all of it. In that silent standstill, I realized something crucial. As messy and dramatic as my revenge was, it had accomplished the one thing I truly needed, to shine a public spotlight on Fletcher's criminal behavior. Even if he tried to mount a legal defense, he couldn't hide the evidence. Not with multiple cameras rolling and a crowd of neighbors ready to testify. I turned to the officer, exhaling a ragged breath. "I'm prepared to face the consequences of what I did," I said. "But I'd also like to file a formal complaint against Fletcher and the HOA for tampering with my property and endangering my family's health. I have footage, lab results, and now a witness record that he was holding that vial." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Mrs. Robbins gave me a nod of solidarity. Somewhere in the back, I saw the hooded figure slip away around the corner of the building, perhaps deciding the jig was up. Fletcher looked like he wanted to scream, but no sound emerged. And with that, the officer motioned for me to wait aside while he radioed for another patrol car. The neighbors, phones still out, captured every angle of Fletcher's downfall. In the distance, the rumbling engine of the manure truck faded away, mission accomplished. We stood there, inhaling a mix of relief and the overwhelming stench of manure. Whatever legal storms lay ahead, I knew I'd finally turned the tables on the man who'd thought he could poison me into submission. The HOA might still be an obstacle, but Fletcher's iron grip on the neighborhood had been irreparably cracked. And for me, that was worth every ounce of trouble. By the time another patrol car arrived, the morning sun had fully risen, revealing the situation in stark clarity. A steaming mountain of manure blocking the HOA office's back door, a flustered and cornered Fletcher, and a crowd of neighbors capturing every second on their phones. The second officer stepped out, took one whiff of the scene, and practically recoiled, coughing into his sleeve. It was almost comical if you ignored the underlying tension. The original officer began taking formal statements, starting with me. I described the contamination of my water tanks, the lab results, the threats I'd received, and the vile Fletcher had tried to hide. My voice shook with adrenaline, but I forced myself to be as clear as possible, emphasizing that yes, I dumped the manure, but only after Fletcher's repeated attempts to sabotage me. Fletcher stood off to the side, bristling and glaring at anyone who made eye contact. He'd pulled out his phone to call someone, likely Ms. Crane, the HOA's lawyer, but from the snippets we overheard, it didn't sound like he was getting the response he wanted. The hooded figure had vanished completely, leaving Fletcher without backup. As the second officer questioned him, Fletcher's grandiose excuses fell flat against the stench clinging to the air. Meanwhile, several neighbors insisted on telling the police about their own run-ins with the HOA. A chorus of grievances filled the parking lot: unjust fines, blackmail threats, heavy-handed enforcement. Mrs. Robbins made sure to bring up rumors that Fletcher had been calling in favors from a couple of local contractors to do his dirty work. It was clear the story had ballooned far beyond just me. The entire neighborhood was on the brink of a full-scale rebellion against the HOA president. With 2 patrol cars flashing red and blue, more residents gathered. Some covered their noses, others wore determined scowls. It felt like an impromptu town hall meeting, except instead of a podium, we had a reeking pile of manure. The spectacle was enough to draw out the local news reporter, who arrived with a cameraman, capturing the aftermath in real time. I almost laughed at how surreal it all felt. Fletcher, realizing the cameras were rolling, attempted one last act of damage control. "This is a gross overreaction," he proclaimed to the reporter, voice quavering. "I've never endangered anyone. It's all fabricated evidence." But behind him, the officer held up the vial of chemicals, carefully sealed in a plastic bag for forensic review. The camera zoomed in, capturing Fletcher's face contorting in a mix of fear and rage. Eventually, the police separated Fletcher and me, asking each of us not to interfere while they collected evidence. My ears burned with the possibility I could be arrested for trespassing and vandalism. But then, something unexpected happened. A neighbor I barely knew, a quiet man named David, stepped forward. He mentioned he had ring camera footage capturing strange late-night activity around my greenhouse, including the exact moment those hooded intruders snuck in. Another resident offered a written statement confirming Fletcher had bragged about teaching me a lesson regarding my water tanks. With that avalanche of testimonies, the mood shifted. While I'd certainly face consequences for my extreme action, it was now painfully clear Fletcher was in deeper legal trouble. The officers radioed for a detective to investigate the alleged poisoning, and they strongly advised Fletcher not to leave town. One official even told me quietly, "What you did was reckless, but it might have led to some important answers. We'll be in touch." Over the next week, Fletcher found himself the target of a formal police inquiry. The detective conducted interviews with neighbors, combed through financial records for any sign of bribes or illegal dealings, and tested the chemical from the vial. Though the legal wheels turned slowly, word spread that Fletcher might be indicted if prosecutors found enough evidence tying him to the water contamination and the break-in at my greenhouse. Meanwhile, the HOA board held an emergency session. Pictures and videos of the manure incident circulated online, turning Fletcher into a laughingstock, a cautionary tale of HOA tyranny gone too far. Desperate to salvage their reputation, the board voted to suspend him as president pending the investigation. A few members even reached out to me, offering a sort of half-apology and promising to re-evaluate the association's rigid bylaws. For my part, I didn't escape scot-free. I received a hefty fine for the unauthorized dumping of bio-waste, and I had to attend a mandatory mediation session. The city cited me for property damage, though ironically, the only real damage was the permanent stink that clung to the HOA office's back entrance for days. But considering the risk I'd taken, it felt like a small price to pay. News outlets briefly covered the story, dubbing it a case of HOA gone wild. The public outrage focused on Fletcher's bullying tactics and the alleged poisoning. Most people, reading the sensational headlines, seemed to side with me. Countless comments online declared, "HOAs always overstep. This guy just took a stand." Once the dust settled, I worked with a lawyer to press charges for trespassing and attempted poisoning. It turned into a protracted legal ordeal, but I was far from alone. Some neighbors who'd endured Fletcher's threats came forward with their own lawsuits. As the claims piled up, Fletcher's bravado turned to silence. Rumor had it he was planning to move away, trying to sell his house quietly. Without his allies, and with the board distancing themselves from him, he had nowhere to hide. My water tanks were replaced, and I finally felt safe enough to use them again. But every time I poured a glass of water or watered my greenhouse plants, I remembered the bitter taste of betrayal, and the moment I decided enough was enough. Ironically, the manure stunt brought the neighborhood closer together. People who used to ignore each other bonded over the shared shock of what happened. Some new board members seemed genuinely interested in making the HOA less draconian, more supportive. One morning, a few weeks later, I took a walk past the HOA building. The parking lot was clear, no sign of police tape or manure remnants. Yet if you looked closely near the back entrance, you could still see faint discolorations on the pavement, where the manure had once formed a colossal, reeking mound. I paused, feeling a wave of emotions: relief, vindication, and maybe a dash of lingering anger. But mostly, I felt free. No more anonymous threats slipped under my door, no more forced compliance notices pinned to my front porch. Fletcher's reign had ended. Sure, I'd always be the neighbor who dumped manure on the HOA. But for me, it was a badge of defiance, proof that sometimes you have to fight fire with fertilizer to protect your home and your family. Maybe I didn't handle it perfectly, but I never regretted exposing Fletcher's corruption for all the world to see. And if I ever caught a whiff of tyranny creeping back into our neighborhood, I knew exactly where to find another big, smelly truck.